My name is Ethan, and for a long time, I thought I was destined to inherit greatness. Growing up, I was the golden boy of our family, smart, ambitious, and, in my grandfather's eyes, a symbol of the future. Grandfather Paul built our family business from scratch. It wasn't just a company to him, it was his life's work. He loved to tell the story of how he started in a small office with a single desk and a phone, working tirelessly to turn that dream into a thriving real estate enterprise. I had always looked up to him. He was larger than life, respected, and someone I aspired to impress. But there was one person who overshadowed everything in my mind, my Uncle Ryan. Ryan was my grandfather's right-hand man, the one who had spent 12 years managing the company. While Grandfather Paul set the vision, Ryan ran the operations. He knew every client, every employee, and every inch of the business. People trusted him because he earned it, working late nights, solving problems, and building relationships. To the rest of the company, Ryan was the glue that kept everything together. And then, on my grandfather's 62nd birthday, everything changed. The party was lavish, like everything my grandparents did. They invited everyone, extended family, friends, business partners, and clients. Grandfather Paul was in a great mood, laughing, shaking hands, and basking in the admiration of his guests. I was there too, fresh out of college with a shiny degree in business. I felt like I had something to prove. After all, I was the one with the education, the fresh ideas, and the bright future. Or at least that's what I told myself. As dinner wrapped up, Grandfather Paul clinked his glass to get everyone's attention. The room fell silent, and he stood tall, smiling as if he held the world in his hands. I thought it would be another one of his famous speeches, a mix of humor, nostalgia, and wisdom. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. "It's a special evening, and not just because I'm turning 62. After much thought and consideration, I've decided it's time for me to step back and let the next generation take over." The room buzzed with murmurs and anticipation. I felt my heart start to race. Was this it? Was this the moment he would name Ryan as the new CEO? My uncle was sitting across the table, his face calm and composed, though I could see the faintest trace of pride in his eyes. He deserved this. Everyone knew it. And so, Grandfather Paul continued, raising his glass higher, "I'm proud to announce that my grandson Ethan will be taking over as CEO." For a second, I froze. I wasn't sure if I'd heard him right. Me? Did he just say me? The applause erupted, and I felt hands patting my back, voices congratulating me. But amidst the noise, my mind was spinning. My uncle's face had fallen just slightly. Not anger, not even surprise, just a quiet, restrained disappointment. I stood up, gave a nod, and thanked everyone for their support, but my voice felt hollow. I glanced at Ryan as I sat back down. He smiled faintly, as if to say, "Good for you," but there was no mistaking the weight behind his eyes. That night, the house felt quieter after the guests had left. My grandparents were still giddy with excitement, but I felt an invisible wall rising between us and Ryan. He had spent over a decade building this company. He had earned the respect of the employees, the clients, and the business community. Yet, here I was, handed a title I hadn't fought for, one I wasn't sure I deserved. I tried to talk myself into confidence. "Grandfather sees something in you," I thought. "You have fresh ideas. You just graduated. You can do this." But deep down, I knew the truth. I was stepping into shoes far too big for me, and everyone knew it. The next day, the reality of my new position hit me like a punch to the gut. Grandfather Paul called me into his office to discuss my plans. He was all smiles, telling me how proud he was and how much potential I had. "You're going to take this company to places Ryan never could," he said with confidence. I nodded along, but his words didn't sit right with me. Ryan had already taken the company to great heights. Without him, it wouldn't be what it was today. Still, I swallowed my doubt and told myself that this was my moment. But when I walked through the office later that day, the energy felt different. Whispers stopped when I walked by, and I caught glances that were anything but congratulatory. It was clear what the employees thought. The kid with no experience is taking over. I tried to keep my head high, pretending I didn't notice. Ryan wasn't there. He had packed up his things and left without a word. That stung more than I wanted to admit. A part of me wanted him to fight back, to say something. Another part of me was relieved he didn't. Over the next few days, I tried to settle into my new role. My grandfather handed me files, introduced me to key clients, and reminded me of the opportunity I'd been given. I did everything I could to look the part, meeting with department heads, reviewing contracts, and pretending I knew what I was doing. But I didn't. The business world was nothing like my college lectures. It was sharp, fast, and unforgiving. At night, I sat at my desk for hours, staring at spreadsheets and reports, trying to make sense of numbers that refused to line up. I told myself I was just getting started, that everyone struggled at first, but the weight of the company, of my family's expectations, and the shadow of Ryan's absence bore down on me relentlessly. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. The first few weeks as CEO were a whirlwind of meetings, decisions, and an overwhelming sense of inadequacy. I wanted to make a strong start, to prove to everyone, including myself, that my grandfather hadn't made a mistake. But the more I tried to assert myself, the more obvious it became that I was out of my depth. The employees treated me with a distant politeness, the kind reserved for someone they didn't quite respect but had to tolerate. It wasn't hostility, but it was clear they didn't see me as a leader. I'd overhear whispers in the break room or catch skeptical glances in meetings. I tried to ignore it, but it gnawed at me. I thought new ideas would win them over. I came in with what I called a fresh vision, pushing for bold changes in how we operated. My grandfather had encouraged this. He believed the company needed to evolve to stay competitive. I reorganized departments, adjusted long-standing client contracts, and introduced flashy marketing campaigns that looked great on paper. But I underestimated the complexities of the business and the trust built around stability. One by one, those changes started to backfire. The first blow came from the sales team. My decision to overhaul how we structured commissions created confusion and resentment. Instead of motivating them, it disrupted the workflow they had perfected under Ryan's leadership. A few senior employees quit, taking their expertise and loyal clients with them. Next came the clients. I tried renegotiating terms on some of our longest-standing contracts, hoping to boost revenue. But these were deals Ryan had painstakingly nurtured over the years, relationships built on trust and mutual respect. My changes came off as pushy, even arrogant. Within weeks, a handful of our biggest accounts walked away, leaving a gaping hole in our revenue stream. I tried to salvage things, scrambling to repair the damage, but the harder I worked, the more it felt like quicksand. Every decision seemed to lead to another problem. The team was frustrated, clients were leaving, and I started to feel the walls closing in. At home, I tried to hide how much I was struggling. My grandfather still believed in me, constantly reassuring me that I just needed time to adjust. He saw the early setbacks as growing pains, but I knew better. The weight of his trust felt suffocating, like a rope tightening around my chest. One night, after a particularly brutal day, I sat alone in my office staring at the numbers. The company was losing money and I had no idea how to stop the bleeding. For the first time, I let myself admit a hard truth. I wasn't ready for this. Maybe I never would be. But instead of stepping back and asking for help, I doubled down. I convinced myself that I just needed to work harder, to find some way to turn things around. That desperation led me to my worst mistake yet. I decided to fudge the numbers. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just a small adjustment to make our financials look more appealing to a potential new client. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd fix everything once the deal went through. But the moment I hit send on that email, I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. It didn't take long for the truth to catch up with me. The client flagged inconsistencies in the documents and pulled out of the deal. Worse, the discrepancies triggered an internal audit. Suddenly, the company was under scrutiny for financial misconduct, and the fallout was swift and brutal. My grandfather, who had defended me through every misstep, was now facing the harsh reality of what I'd done. Employees started resigning in droves, lawsuits began piling up, and the company's reputation was in shambles. I wanted to believe I could still fix it, but deep down, I knew the damage was irreparable. The fallout from my mistakes was swift and relentless, like a dam bursting. In just a few months, everything unraveled. Clients were leaving faster than we could send apologies. Lawsuits began to mount, each one another nail in the coffin of what had once been a thriving business. The employees who had stuck around were walking on eggshells, waiting for the inevitable crash. I tried to maintain a facade of control, but it was slipping away. The pressure was unbearable. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and spent hours staring at spreadsheets I didn't know how to fix. Every decision I made seemed to make things worse. I was flailing, drowning, and I knew it. My grandfather, who had championed me so proudly, began to look at me differently. He didn't say much, but the disappointment was clear in his eyes. He still defended me to others, brushing off the mounting chaos as a learning curve. But behind closed doors, the cracks were showing. One evening, we had a meeting with our remaining senior staff. My grandfather insisted on being present, perhaps hoping to lend me credibility, but it didn't help. The staff was blunt. "The clients don't trust us anymore," one said. "Our reputation is shot. We're barely keeping the lights on." I could feel my grandfather's eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze. After the meeting, he pulled me aside. For the first time, he didn't try to sugarcoat things. "Mike," he said, his voice heavy, "you've got to face reality. This isn't working." I wanted to argue, to remind him that he'd chosen me, that he'd put me in this position. But the words caught in my throat. He was right, it wasn't working, and deep down, I knew it never had. The final blow came a few weeks later. The company had run out of money. My grandparents had poured their savings into keeping things afloat, selling off assets to cover debts and legal fees. But it wasn't enough. The lawsuits were bleeding us dry, and the clients who might have saved us were long gone. My grandfather called a family meeting. For the first time, he looked defeated. He announced that the company would be downsizing significantly, selling off its main office, and letting go of nearly all remaining staff. My grandmother was in tears, clutching his hand as he spoke. I sat there in stunned silence, the weight of my failure pressing down on me. It wasn't just the business that was crumbling. The family was fracturing under the strain. My grandfather and my mother, his daughter, began arguing more frequently, each blaming the other for what had gone wrong. My grandmother tried to mediate, but her own grief made it difficult. I could see the toll it was taking on her. As for me, I became a ghost in my own home. I avoided family dinners, skipped meetings, and locked myself in my room whenever possible. I couldn't face them. Not my grandparents, not my mother, and certainly not myself. The guilt was suffocating. I had wanted so badly to prove myself, to live up to the expectations placed on me. But instead, I had destroyed the legacy my grandfather had spent decades building. The thought of it was unbearable. One night, I overheard my grandparents talking in hushed tones. "We should have chosen Ryan," my grandfather said, his voice breaking. "He was always the one keeping everything together." Hearing that gutted me. I had always known, deep down, that Ryan was better suited for the role. He had the experience, the respect of the staff, and the trust of the clients. But my grandparents' favoritism, my mother's insistence that I was the future, had blinded them, and now we were all paying the price. Desperate to make amends, I decided to reach out to Ryan. It was a long shot, but I hoped that maybe he could help salvage what was left. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe forgiveness, maybe guidance, maybe a miracle. What I got was a brutal dose of reality. When I called him, he didn't sound angry, just tired. "What do you want, Mike?" he asked, his voice flat. I stumbled over my words trying to explain the situation, but he cut me off. "Let me guess," he said. "Grandpa and Grandma sent you to fix their mess?" "No," I said quickly, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. I thought you might have some advice." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Advice? Here's some. Take responsibility for your own actions. Stop running to other people to bail you out." His words stung, but they were fair. He went on, his tone growing colder. "You had a chance to learn from me, Mike, to understand how this business worked. But you didn't care. You thought you could do it all on your own, and now you're surprised it fell apart?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said weakly. "Of course you didn't," he snapped. "But intentions don't matter, Mike. Results do. And the result is you destroyed everything I worked for." There was a long silence. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but what could I say? He was right. "I'm sorry," I said finally, the words barely above a whisper. "So am I," he replied, and then he hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. I had hoped that talking to Ryan would give me some clarity, some direction. Instead, it left me feeling more lost than ever. For the first time, I realized there was no fixing this. The company was gone, the family was in shambles, and I was to blame. All I could do now was pick up the pieces of my own life and figure out how to move forward. After Ryan's rejection, I was left with no choice but to confront the truth. I had failed. Completely. The business was gone, my grandparents' finances were in ruins, and my mother was furious at everyone but herself. Most of all, I felt the crushing weight of my own inadequacy. My grandparents had to sell the company's main office, a building that had been the family's pride for decades. It wasn't just a workspace. It was a symbol of everything my grandfather had built, everything I had squandered. The sale barely made a dent in the debts piling up, and the lawsuits kept coming. The reputation of the company was so tarnished that even the mention of its name in business circles was met with scoffs or pity. At home, the atmosphere was unbearable. My grandparents barely spoke to each other. My grandmother, always the peacekeeper, looked perpetually worn down, her once cheerful demeanor replaced with a quiet sadness. My grandfather, who had always been my biggest supporter, spent most of his days locked in his study. I knew he was working tirelessly to figure out some way to salvage what was left, but there was nothing left to save. And my mother, she was angry, not at me, though she should have been, but at everyone else. She blamed my grandfather for letting Ryan walk away. She blamed the employees who had left when things started to fall apart. She even blamed the clients for not being loyal enough, but she never blamed herself or me. Her unwavering belief in my potential, even in the face of undeniable failure, felt less like support and more like delusion. It made me resent her in ways I didn't think possible. I spent my days hiding in my room, scrolling aimlessly through job boards and avoiding my family. I told myself I was trying to figure things out, but the truth was, I was paralyzed. I didn't know how to move forward. The shame of what I'd done was suffocating. I couldn't bring myself to apply for jobs because I knew my resume would invite questions I didn't want to answer. How do you explain running a successful company into the ground in less than a year? Eventually, the silence became too much. I needed to get out of the house, away from the constant reminders of my failure. I packed a bag and moved in with my mother. She had been living alone ever since my parents divorced, and she welcomed me with open arms. I think she was relieved to have someone to distract her from her own loneliness. But for me, it was just another escape. Living with my mother was a strange experience. On the surface, she was supportive, always encouraging me to try again or find a new path. But there was an undercurrent of tension in everything she said. It was clear she still believed I was destined for greatness, that my failure was just a temporary setback. I knew she meant well, but her words felt like a weight around my neck, a constant reminder of expectations I could never meet. Meanwhile, Ryan was thriving. Word got around that he had started his own business, and from what little I heard, it was doing well. Former employees from our company had joined him, and even some of the clients who had left us were now working with him. It stung to know that he was succeeding where I had failed, but I couldn't blame him. He had earned it. I had not. One day, I ran into one of our former employees at a coffee shop. She was surprised to see me, but she hid it well. "Hey, Mike," she said, her tone neutral. "How's it going?" "Could be better," I admitted, trying to sound casual. She nodded, then hesitated. "You know, a lot of us didn't blame you for what happened," she said finally. "We knew you were in over your head. It wasn't fair what they put on you." Her words were meant to be kind, but they cut deep. She was right. I hadn't been ready for the responsibility, and everyone had known it except me. I thanked her awkwardly and left, but her words stayed with me. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that maybe I wasn't entirely to blame. Maybe my grandparents, my mother, and even Ryan had played a role in creating the perfect storm that led to the company's downfall. Still, that realization didn't absolve me of my own failures. I had made bad decisions. I had ignored advice. I had let my pride and fear of looking weak drive me to make choices that hurt everyone around me. And now, I was paying the price. Over time, I began to see my grandparents less and less. The distance wasn't intentional, but it was inevitable. They were dealing with their own fallout, trying to piece together what was left of their lives. I couldn't face them, couldn't bear to see the disappointment in their eyes. My grandmother occasionally called to check in, her voice always soft and sad, but my grandfather never reached out. I don't think he could. My mother, on the other hand, refused to let go. She continued to push me to rebuild, to prove them all wrong. She even floated the idea of starting another business together, but I shut it down immediately. I wasn't ready for that, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. I needed time to figure out who I was outside of the shadow of my family and the failure of the business. It wasn't until I hit rock bottom, truly rock bottom, that I realized I needed help. One night, after yet another argument with my mother about my future, I locked myself in my room and broke down. The weight of everything, the failure, the shame, the pressure, was too much. I couldn't do it alone anymore. The next day, I made an appointment with a therapist. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. For the first time, I was taking control of my own life, not trying to live up to anyone else's expectations. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't keep running from my past. It's been a year since everything fell apart. A year since I stepped down from the company, left the ruins behind, and moved in with my mother. In that time, I've learned more about myself than I thought possible. Lessons I wish I'd understood before taking the position of CEO. The failure, as painful as it was, became my greatest teacher. Therapy was my first real breakthrough. At first, I was skeptical. The idea of sitting in a room and talking about my problems with a stranger felt pointless. But week by week, session by session, I started to unpack everything I'd buried deep down. The pressure from my family, the guilt I carried over the company's collapse, and, most importantly, the unrealistic expectations I'd placed on myself. My therapist didn't offer me solutions. Instead, she helped me see that I wasn't defined by my failure. It was just one chapter in my life, not the entire story. One of the most eye-opening moments came when we talked about my childhood. I'd always thought of myself as the chosen one in the family, the golden child who could do no wrong. But in therapy, I started to see how that narrative had set me up to fail. My grandparents had put me on a pedestal, yes, but it wasn't out of love. It was out of their own need to control the family legacy. I wasn't chosen because I was special. I was chosen because I was convenient. I fit their idea of what a successor should be, young, ambitious, and easy to mold. Realizing that was both freeing and heartbreaking. Meanwhile, life at my mother's house remained a strange mix of support and suffocation. She tried to be encouraging, but her constant talk of bouncing back felt like pressure to reclaim something I didn't even want anymore. I had no interest in returning to the business world, not as a CEO, not as anything. I needed to figure out who I was without the family name attached. It wasn't easy. For months, I floated between odd jobs, doing whatever I could to keep myself busy and pay for therapy. I worked as a barista for a while, then did some freelance graphic design. None of it felt permanent, but that was okay. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing a title or a legacy. I was just trying to live. Occasionally, I'd hear updates about Ryan. He was thriving. His new business was growing steadily, and former employees from our company were flocking to him in droves. Even some of the old clients who had left during my disastrous tenure had returned to work with him. It stung, but I couldn't deny that he deserved it. Ryan had built something on his own terms, without the safety net of family privilege. I envied him for that, but I also respected him. He'd done what I couldn't. My grandparents, on the other hand, were still struggling. They had sold the last of their major assets to cover the lawsuits, and from what I heard, they were living in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town. My grandmother occasionally called to check in, her voice always tinged with sadness, but my grandfather remained distant. I think he blamed himself for everything, though he would never admit it. As much as I wanted to hate him for the position he put me in, I couldn't. He was human, flawed, and fallible, just like me. Then, one day I got a call I didn't expect. It was Ryan. "Hey, Mike," he said, his tone hesitant. "Do you have a minute?" I hadn't spoken to him since the day he refused to help the company. Hearing his voice now brought back a flood of emotions, anger, shame, and, strangely, relief. "Yeah," I said cautiously. "What's up?" "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," he began. "The company, Grandpa and Grandma, us. I wanted to check in, see how you're doing." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to hang up, but another part of me the part that missed the bond we used to have as kids, wanted to hear him out. I'm managing, I said finally. Therapy's helping. That's good, he said. I'm glad you're taking care of yourself. Listen, Mike, I know things between us haven't been great, but I want you to know I don't blame you for what happened. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. You don't? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No, he said firmly. You were put in an impossible position. Grandpa and Grandma set you up to fail, and I should have spoken up. I should have been there for you. But I let my own anger get in the way. I didn't know what to say. For so long, I'd carried the weight of my family's disappointment and my own self-loathing. But hearing Ryan acknowledge the truth felt like a release. Thank you, I said finally. That means a lot. Ryan and I talked for over an hour that day. He told me about his new business, how he'd built it from scratch, and how he was trying to create a culture that valued people over profits. It's not perfect, he admitted, but I'm proud of it, and I think you'd be good at something like this too. I laughed, the idea of starting another business feeling almost absurd. I think I'll stick to freelance work for now, I said, but thanks for the vote of confidence. Over the next few months, Ryan and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. It wasn't easy. We had years of resentment and misunderstandings to work through, but for the first time, it felt like we were on equal footing. He wasn't the forgotten brother, and I wasn't the golden child. We were just two people trying to find our way. As for my grandparents, I eventually mustered the courage to visit them. Their apartment was small but cozy, a far cry from the lavish house they used to own. My grandmother greeted me with tears in her eyes, pulling me into a hug so tight it almost hurt. My grandfather, though more reserved, offered a small smile and a handshake. It wasn't much, but it was a start. We talked for hours that day, about the company, about our family, about the future. For the first time, my grandfather apologized. He admitted that he'd made a mistake by putting me in charge, that he should have trusted Ryan or kept the position himself until we were both ready. Hearing him say those words was bittersweet. It didn't erase the past, but it gave me a sense of closure I didn't know I needed. Now, as I sit here reflecting on everything, I feel a strange mix of emotions. The pain of failure still lingers, but it's no longer all-consuming. I've learned to accept that failure doesn't define me. It shapes me. It's taught me resilience, humility, and the importance of forging my own path. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time, that doesn't scare me. I'm no longer the golden child, no longer the CEO, no longer the person trying to live up to impossible expectations. I'm just Mike, a flawed but determined person who's finally learning to live for himself. And for now, that's enough.